Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out another Luetin video. Gotta love Luetin. This is 40k's worst times to be alive. Kind of a tall order. Let's get into it. But before we get started, of course, be sure to check out the merch store. I have the link down below. I realized that someone pointed out that I used a link shortener that I guess got hacked and was redirecting people to some nonsense spam site. So I've put the link direct to the Teespring store. So you should be able to access it now. Other than that, yeah, let's get into it. Oh, man. Dun, 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 dun. Only war. I mean, this is the far future. I mean, no justice without fear. No fear without suffering. Conrad Cruz may be onto something here. Primarch of the Night Lords. Yeah, worst times to be alive in the dark far future. Part 1. It's going to have to be like part 1 of 7 because there's only bad times. The galaxy is indeed a cruel place.
In the 41st millennium, the galaxy is now dominated by humanity. Having first ventured out into the stars at least some 30,000 years previous, in a time roughly framed as the Stellar Exodus, just how many hostile enemies humankind faced in these early periods is largely unknown. But by the period entering into the 30th millennium, things are well established as either being stable, challenging, or nightmarish. But things would only then deteriorate over the coming 10,000 years, where, although humans would forge new unity through the Imperium, the threats it faces both outside its empire and internally are legion. The worlds of humanity face horrific enemies on a near permanent basis, alien horrors, the corruption of their souls, and the prospect of being dragged into what they might abstractly understand to be the equivalent of the mythical hell itself. They also face...
Yeah, again. It's 40k, dude. The universe is terrible.
Civil war amongst itself, or just summary destruction by those who deemed it necessary. Yet much of the fighting within this dark age results in fairly swift destruction. Cities and planets may be razed, weapons are so powerful and fierce you may know nothing of what hit you before you are erased from existence. Many weapons fire projectiles so large or energy beams so intense that little will be left of you to have to worry about just what had occurred. But, as a Bond villain once said, there are worse things than dying. It could be considered this is something of a worst deaths in 40k list, but I wanted to be more potentially broader than that to keep things as interesting as possible, because we all know there are plenty of bad ways to die in 40k. But I'll always try to throw in a couple of unconventional options to stop this list being simply, and then there's an even more painful thing. This is actually an endless problem within the verse of 40k that...
Of course it is.
Everything seems to go one step more edgy than whatever came before it, to the point where you start to consider, wouldn't somebody just black out and have a heart attack from the horror of whatever's being done to them? And yes, and I'm sure that happens. But I've tried to cast a broad net beyond just how much pain do you want, and also I've included options that are not just that of an individual. As always though, if you have your own worst nightmare to avoid in the galaxy of M41, throw it in the comments. If you have a 40k list you would like me to put together, suggest that in the comments too. I've got many lined up, but always open to suggestions. So with that, let's begin, and remembering that in the bleakness of the Imperium, where billions die on a daily basis, your personal experience means nothing, and you will certainly not be missed.
Okay, I just want to point this reality out. In World War I, that was kind of the zenith or the coming of age of true industrial warfare. There was some precursors, the Napoleonic era, the American Civil War, but only in the First World War did a truly fleshed out industrial scale war take place. And one of the things that defined war at an industrial scale is that human beings could be treated organizationally like objects. Their lives sort of tossed away without really thinking about it. And it's easy to see how the officers, the commanders, and even the countries just were so cavalier with people's lives. They really didn't mean anything. If you want to understand what I'm talking about, there is a monument. I'm sure there are several, but there's one in France to not just the war dead, but the war dead whose bodies were just never recovered. Who, you have to think, in the chaos of battle, they just sort of got obliterated or sucked into the mud or trampled over until they were just worth nothing, right? And the monument is inscribed with names, maybe this big, and it's the size of probably like l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It's massive. And so just the scale of this, the scale of the fact that those aren't the war dead, those aren't the war participants, those aren't the war dead, that's just the ones who we think were just sort of deleted from existence. No body recovered. They're probably buried somewhere. Somewhere out in an old battlefield that someone with enough time digging around will stumble into their 100, 200, 300-year-old bones. You know, it's wild to think about. And so, like, I think as human beings sometimes we forget that because we live in this world of individual stories where, you know, we all know the person who went viral for, you know, making a scene on a flight and getting duct taped or whatever. And, you know, we think that therefore, like, our brains are wired for a community of 150 people, you know, so, like, they're wired to view those stories as, like, a friend of a friend. But we don't understand that in a country of 350 million people, it's like putting one pepper flake in, like, 6 barrels of salt, right? And then pulling out one grain. It doesn't mean, it's so small, it is meaningless, right? Just like you could sell that salt with one pepper flake in it as being 100% pure salt, right? It is as pure as possible. And yet you could still have it's still in theory possible if you looked hard enough, you could pick it out and go, look, these barrels of salt are full of pepper. That's how insignificant we are as human beings in the modern day. And we forget that, I think, when we, you know, blame ourselves for things going on in the larger world. We believe we have these, like, moral obligations to do this thing or that thing or contribute in that way or the other way. And it's like it evokes this cult of self-importance that people have that just isn't true. Just isn't true, right? The books are wrong. You are not special. You are not a snowflake. And you cannot change the world.
So let's start off strong with the most obvious and perverse weirdos in the galaxy, the Drukhari. They've been getting off on pain and torture for literally tens of thousands of years, and they're by now complete experts at this. And so the very last thing you want to have happen is to be taken alive by them. The reason I chose the Dark Eldar as the first choice is because they also circumvent the problem I mentioned of painful things likely killing you by the sheer shock of whatever horrifying thing has been done. The Drukhari avoid this by having perfected the art of keeping alive their victims, and the practitioners of the Drukhari art of suffering are those known as the flesh cults and the homunculi. They occupy the vast labyrinth beneath the core of Camorra. Their walkways, halls and corridors are a maze of optical weird illusions. Living human mortals are twisted into the formation of objects, and many things appear to be still in a state of living death, despite the seeming impossibility of such a fact. It's interesting how, despite attempting to avoid falling prey to Slaanesh and Chaos, the Drukhari are in many ways actually acting out practices also used by those in Chaos itself. For the Drukhari, though, their desire to inflict horrifying suffering is by now integral to their entire way of life. It's their leisure, their trade, and even the means by which they invigorate and seek to preserve and extend their lifespan. The reason, of course, any Drukhari should want to avoid permanent death of their physical form should be obvious. They wish to avoid their soul being released, having no other place to go than into the waiting clutches of Slaanesh. And within the Dark Eldar, those known as the homunculi have learned how to restore an entire Drakari body with the smallest amount of their remains. This also connects with the concept that Eldar souls behave differently than, say, when a human dies, for their soul simply bleeds into the warp, but Eldar souls seem to exert some semblance of willpower over what happens next, or I should say at least they formally did, not necessarily going into the warp, but laying in something of a purgatory. For the Drakari though, providing their...
Yeah, okay, that's one of the things that's really interesting in the lore is that you have these ensouled beings that all have sentience and are capable of rationality, but it varies completely on how ensouled they are, right? Which is, of course, in humanity, we align the soul with ideas about fundamental goodness, fundamental evil. There's a certain humanness that we religiously ascribe to the soul, right? Obviously, in the Catholic tradition, you have like the immortal soul, which carries original sin, which can be cleansed and washed away. But so this idea that you can have two beings both capable of understanding right from wrong, which again, in at least the Christian or Catholic tradition, is sort of the defining trait of having a soul, varies so wildly, right? Both a human and Eldar could discern the wrongness of, say, killing a child, yet they behave totally differently in terms of how their souls interact with the warp.
Their physical body can...
Then that's to say nothing of the Tau, right?
Be restored within a day or so, there's a strong chance their soul will be able to locate it and resume their bizarre state of eternal undeath. This is also the reason why the Drakari are raiders. They don't seek extended conflicts like the Craftworld Eldari, for they're able to use spirit stones to preserve their souls and prevent them being stolen by Slaanesh. But the Drakari can't do this, and so they seek out fast assaults to the Imperium that give them maximum reward and minimum risk. These raids are very often in the service of capturing human victims to be returned to Khemora and the homunculi, and this is something you absolutely do not want to happen. The reason being that the Drakari are, as I said, rejuvenated by witnessing, feeling, emotionally connecting with agony and pain, and if saturated with enough of it, they can heal from almost any wound. The Drakari are the masters of torture and degradation. They've spent thousands of years perfecting their art, and the longer a Drakari can drag out a punishment, the greater the nourishment that can be derived from it. The Drakari who has recently fed upon the torment of others will shine with a cold, startling aura. Their physical form is restored into perfection even as the spirit within is festering. One who is starved of such energies for long enough will become a shadow, desperately hunting for a taste of pain with which to stave off the gnawing pangs in the depths of their soul. And for the Drakari, the problem with this is that they ever suffer the problem of diminishing returns. Simply put, they have gotten used to the idea of pain and suffering. Over thousands of years, they have seen it all, and so now they seek ever more extreme and outlandish ways to inflict pain on others and thereby get the most benefit from it.
You know, what's interesting is this is actually, again, an exaggerated Warhammer 40k-ified illustration of a real principle, which is sometimes called acculturation or tolerance. Not that sort of tolerance. In the case of a drug, right, or a substance like alcohol, you can develop a tolerance. And, of course, that's your body normalizing and being able to process faster and more effectively the same amount of a poisonous or toxic substance. One of the reasons that overdose deaths actually are so very high after people have rehab stints is because when they decide to use, they use what to them feels like a normal or maybe slightly less than normal amount of their drug of choice, not realizing that after a long stint in rehab, their tolerance has dropped back down to that of a relatively new user. And so they take what would have been a typical dose to produce a normal high. Instead, they end up taking what becomes a lethal dose to their body with its reduced tolerance. The cultural equivalent to that is called acculturation, and that is the process of taking something that is seen as strange and making it become normal. An easy example is putting in contact lenses. For those of you that have never used contact lenses, I actually got them in college before I had the army lasered my eyes right. And it was so hard to acculturate myself to touching my eyeball, right? Or almost touching your eyeball in placing these lenses. So, of course, once you got used to that, it became very normal and soon became something that you can do, in any relatively clean environment. The more insidious acculturation is when people do it with scammers or when they're running scams or trying to manipulate others. And they use what's sometimes called a compliance ladder. And a compliance ladder is when you slowly acculturate someone to following your directions, which are increasingly extreme, through manipulation. And so, for example, let's say I wanted to... here's the example that I think of. Let's say I was a Bitcoin scammer, right? Or a romance scammer. That's the best one. I'm a romance scammer, right? I'm in a foreign country. I want to manipulate my target to send me money. That's my ultimate goal. Well, I'm not going to, of course, I'm not going to chat with them and then 3 messages later be like, send me $500. Of course not. I'm going to acculturate them to following my directions. And so I'm going to say, hey, can you send me a photo of your dog? There's nothing wrong with that. Somebody online, you're chatting with them. Great, they do it. Awesome. Hey, I want to send you a package. What's your address? Okay, that's a little suspicious to do, but you send them a picture of your dog, you're like friends. It's not so then you've acculturated them to that. And you slowly work your way up the ladder. Then you try with a trivial amount of money. Something so small it doesn't matter. You go, oh man, my Starbucks app is out. Do you think here's my address. Could you send me $5 so I could cover this coffee? I feel really stupid. When they do it, you're like, I've got them. Then the 5 becomes 10, becomes 50, becomes 100, becomes 1,000. That's how you acculturate someone to take your pick, take your scam pick, right?
For any heavily wounded Drakari, their bodies are passed to the homunculi and are installed into crystal-funded pods arrayed above pain racks and torturing tables. These sarcophagi are arrayed in concentric circles that rise into the darkness above, and each hold a semi-cocooned Drakari warrior in a regenerative state. The patients will literally drink in the dark energy of the torturer's craft as the homunculus works upon the victim below, ably assisted by rack servants and the semi-sentient engines of pain. The cacophony that rises around the chamber enables those installed in the cocoons above to slowly feast upon this energy, so gradually growing back their bodies, skeleton first, muscle, sinew and skin, until they're whole once more. During times of war, it's common for every one of these pods to be filled with red, raw fiends that shiver and rattle with every fresh scream. It's for this reason this would be one of the worst times for you to be taken here alive, but more specifically, you do not want to be taken alive if you are a Primaris Marine. For within the Drakari, the prophets of flesh, otherwise known as the exemplars of excruciation, are feared even among the Drakari. They maintain scores of abattoir-like operating rooms, menials are near permanently going through the actions of dissecting and reconfiguring the musculature and nervous tissues of their subjects into bizarre, misshapen horrors, and they are the masters of the flesh craft, the Drakari art of forming artworks, if you want to call them this, out of the flesh and form of mortals. Such is the boredom of immortality. But the prophets have taken a curious intrigue in the Primaris and the ongoing Indomitus Crusade, for the Primaris not only represent immensely resilient victims for their craft or chambers of endless suffering, but their new genetic material is desired by the Master Homunculus, for he knows that they would provide interesting and unique samples to add to his extensive flesh libraries. So for any Primaris who is taken by the Dark Eldar, they will be suffering the very worst possible at the hands of the Drakari. And
okay, so here is a question, a sort of lore-ish question that I'm sure there's some quirk of lore that lets us answer it. Wouldn't it make more sense to capture a bunch of humans, do some eugenics, or some other sentient species with a really strong presence who is really sensitive to pain and just easily tortured, and just sort of raise them to efficiently be tortured? Or is it like, all right, and just sort of mass produce them, save yourself all the warfare, all the slaughter and the running around and the capturing, and just sort of mass produce these generic looking, they could even be cloned humans that just are extra sensitive to pain, and just take them and just, do your creative business with them, right? Save yourself this tremendous amount of warfare. Why does it have to be individuals captured through war when it in fact involves a whole bunch of more resources just to capture them, and then you got to torture them, and then you got to regenerate your warriors that were lost in the war, then you got to capture more people, which means we're hurting more warriors. The cycle of violence never stops. But I guess that's Warhammer 40k.
Likely for the significantly extended future. So it's bad enough to be kidnapped and dragged away to Komorrah by the Dark Eldar, but if you're Primaris, it appears that your time here is going to be considerably worse. Now next I wanted to include being a free civilization during the Great Crusade as one of the worst times to be alive, because it's one of the things that has continually sat very poorly with me in terms of 40k background. Not because it doesn't make sense, just simply that it annoys me. That thing is the fate of those civilizations who had the audacity to be doing absolutely fine before the Emperor came along. There are not many of these that are specifically documented, and of the many planets encountered during the Great Crusade, many would either be just salvaged, conquered, or willingly join the Imperium of Man. Others refused outright to join this so-called Imperium, for they were either doing very well for themselves or had found other ways to live, and simply wanted to be allowed to do their own thing. Of course, for the Emperor, this was seen as being totally unacceptable. No civilizations, no empires, no planets, cultures could stand alone. You were either part of the Imperium or you would be destroyed through the use of his vast fleets of super soldiers, the legions, the Astartes. But several noteworthy instances spring to mind: the Diasporax, the Interex, Planet 4716, and the Oretian Technocracy. Of these, several were not especially interested in joining with the Imperium. One was up for it, but kind of made a mistake, and the other barely even had a chance to respond. In the case of the Interex and the Oretian Technocracy, both of these civilizations had survived the Age of Strife and somehow maintained the use of their STC databases. It's unknown though how complete these were, and both demonstrated ownership of stable, civilized worlds who had considerably advanced technology. In fact, both proved something of a surprising challenge for the Astartes. In the case of the Oretian Techs, the Imperials would end up drawing in 3 legions of Astartes and take them nearly a year to conquer their civilization, and it appeared that their STC was actively creating new technology to aid them in countering the Imperials. Ultimately, the Imperium would be victorious, however, and quite miserably, these free civilizations would be crushed under the heel of the Emperor's Imperium. But I have often speculated, what would have happened if a civilization such as the Oretian Tech had been more proactive in their expansion pre-Great Crusade? What if they learned in advance of an approaching warmongering crusade and had prepared their defences and grown their army? Things could have been very different and very interesting, with perhaps an enclave in the galaxy of humans who had resisted the Imperium. I always regret this not being a thing, but it...
Yeah, it's always sort of interesting to think about the terrible deal. Most people don't want to be conquered. And as they pointed out, right, the vast majority of planets are not... did not want to resist... the Emperor of Man, or could not, right? They were too primitive and backward that he came literally looking like a god, and some, of course, were probably ruled by demons or Xenos or something else. But I always also feel bad for the planets where, again, in this case, where there was a functioning AI, which cannot be allowed to exist, right? So imagine having this life-saving, a quasi-sacred STC, something that has allowed your civilization to survive its great disconnect from the warp, from the rest of humanity, which you have to think of how scary that must have been, right? Because without warp communication and without a physical, warp transit, warp ships or whatever, then one day you're part of, a great human interstellar civilization, and then just one day the comms go out. Like, imagine if, one day your internet and TV stopped working, and your phone. Like, after a couple hours, you'd be like, I wonder when they're going to get the internet back up. After a day, you'd probably still be like, wonder if everyone's internet is out. After a month, you'd be like, I wonder what happened. What has occurred? Did we get invaded? is there some sort of solar flare? Is there a natural disaster? Did a volcano erupt? Like, without any information, you would have only speculation. So I always wonder if they suddenly went dark and for like 5 or 6 years were just like, any day now, a ship from the Human Federation is going to pull up into orbit and they're going to tell us, oh, the comms are down. There was some weird event in the warp and we're working on it. But for now, we'll be fine. Especially if you were a planet that depended on interstellar shipments of like food, you know, that must have been awful. But it must have taken, you know, again, hundreds of years to realize, or decades to realize that, like, no, your planet's just been cut off. And some of those planets may have thought, hey, just we are cut off, right? The rest of the Human Federation is fine. It's just us who have been sort of snipped, not realizing that the whole galaxy has been plunged into isolation. And so it makes you wonder if, like, when the Emperor did show up, did people be like, oh, okay, it's the Star Federation back again. Good to see them.
It is sadly entirely a fantasy imagining of mine and something that will never be. And so these cultures would be obliterated by the Imperium, and specifically the soon-to-be traitors who were already turning against the Loyalists at this point. Then we have the planet of 4716. The human inhabitants of planet 4716 had long kept records of their people, and it's said could trace their history back over 4,000 years of separation from any other human civilization. They'd come to think about Terra as being something of a myth. And in fact this was true of many human worlds during the Great Crusade when they were reunited. It had been so long many had completely forgotten that Terra was even ever a thing. So when as part of the Great Crusade the Wordbearers' envoys arrived at 4716, the people upon the world were extremely jubilant to now have an opportunity to be reunited with the rest of mankind. Some of the Astartes believed the populace could be re-educated into belief of the Emperor, others thought they should be exterminated. Primarch Lorgar would tell that as a result of the Emperor's judgment that the Wordbearers had moved too slowly in the Great Crusade, that this world was to be made compliant quickly, and by compliant he meant eradicated. So now we have the completely insane situation of a planet who was quite willing to join the Imperium but was going to be destroyed anyway. Simply put, not a good time to be the people of planet 4716, but it gets worse. Lorgar ordered the full-scale planetary bombardment over a sustained period of 12 hours using every major weapon system available. Only one city on the entire planet survived, protected by an unknown and powerful energy field. Lorgar would order a ground assault to exterminate the survivors, but the human defenders proved to have curious and powerful energy weapons. And this continues my theme that many worlds were doing absolutely fine without the Imperium and were in fact very capable of defending themselves. Wordbearers saw lightning bolts fire up to strike down several stormbirds and drop pods from the air, killing hundreds of Wordbearers instantly. Additionally, as the Astartes began to deploy to the surface, they discovered that despite the apocalyptic planetary bombardment, their cities and buildings were generally still intact, and made out of a very strange material that resisted weapons fire. Essentially, somehow they were more technologically advanced than the Imperium at this point, and even more unfortunately for the invading Astartes, the defenders were also made of this same material, or at least their hardware was. They possessed their own smaller, directional energy fields, and the capital was protected by a sizable force of artificial intelligence constructs. These were large, tri-legged lightning throwers in the main, and the lightning bolts discharged from their weapons were strong enough to kill an Astartes in a single strike, not to mention pierce through the armour of both predators and land raiders. This again goes to the tragic case that many of these civilizations, as I say, came very close to resisting the Imperium altogether. Unfortunately, the Wordbearers eventually were able to pierce this city shielding and discovered where the surviving citizenry were located. They were inside a massive central meeting space, apparently at prayer. The Astartes identified a priest figure and ordered their immediate and complete surrender. This priestly leader, in turn, showed his materials of his religion, and to the Wordbearers' sense it became shockingly clear that the people of 4716 worshipped a god that could be very well interpreted as none other than the Emperor, and as such it would be very easy for them to be converted into Imperial citizens. But moreover, exactly the type of citizens the Wordbearers had sought to create, the belief that the Emperor was divine. But yet again, the stupidity of situations caused by the Emperor and his Great Crusade, Lorgar didn't agree to this, and the entire population was slaughtered right there and then.
Yeah, I'm always also curious when you have these situations, which seem to pop up very frequently, where a smarter system would say, hey, we recognize you got these AI constructs, you gotta dumb them down, or you gotta switch them out for servitors. And but we'll take all your energy weapons and all your energy shielding. We'll learn everything we can. We want our Astartes to have these energy shields, right? Like, why? I mean, I also don't understand that, like, on a galactic time scale, like, the Emperor lives forever. Why are you on a Crusader's time scale? You can take 100 years to bring this world into the Imperial fold, right? Give it an ambassador. Tell it, hey, listen, we represent all mankind. We will protect your world no matter what, whether you join us or not. We would really appreciate some help for our protection that we provide you. All it would be is having a basic garrison, right? Again, we talked about the compliance ladder. That's an easy way to do it, right? Cycle people through as the planetary garrison, maybe have some of them serve in, like, the Imperial Navy and then come back so that they have loyalty to the Imperium. And in a couple generations, you'll have this technologically advanced world that is willing to pay its tithes, which is frankly the only thing the Imperium cares about, and doesn't have another god. But even the Emperor spent, hundreds of years getting rid of religion from Earth. He's got to understand that it would take that long to get religion away from the remaining worlds. It just his, like, impatience, the impatience of this crusade is bizarre to me, especially when you're a timeless being.
This is another depressing chapter in the often brutal subjugation of the galaxy that was known as the Great Crusade. And then lastly we have the tale of the Diasporax. So during the Age of Strife, many human worlds were consumed by horrific apocalypse, either through chaos or simply societal collapse. The Diasporax's original homeworld is unknown, but it's presumed as a result of the Age of Strife, similar to the Eldari and their own disaster, they had become a nomadic yet territorial alliance of humans and aliens who were living aboard a vast fleet of starships, powered and maintained by a network of solar collectors around various stars to fuel their vessels' power generators. But for this reason, it meant that they stayed in one specific area of space and didn't really venture out around it. They stayed in this localized area so as to be able to use their power source. The loyalist Iron Hands Legion were the first to encounter these nomads and laid out the standard ultimatum set by the Emperor. They offered the human members of the Diasporax the opportunity to separate from their Xenos allies and to join the Imperium. Unsurprisingly, considering the fact that they had forged a peaceful, democratic and long-entrenched alliance with the alien species and had become very much intertwined cultures, they politely declined. As with all these examples, the Diasporax thought that would be the end of the matter. They were not causing any harm or threat to the Imperium. They just wanted to be able to live their own way and presumed this would be the end of the matter. Tragically, we can predict the reception this was given by the Imperials. The Iron Hands Legion enacted their standing orders to destroy all who stood against the Emperor and refused to be brought under his banner. But the Diasporax proved to be not the bumbling nomads they appeared to be. They were highly skilled and experienced in naval warfare, and they easily evaded multiple fleet engagements initiated by the Astartes and even managed to cause significant damage to an Iron Hands cruiser. Yet again we have an example of a human civilization post-Age of Strife who did not need rescuing or salvation and were more than capable of handling an entire Space Marine legion, which you should remember legions were not like Marine chapters in the modern period. They often would feature superior weapons and hardware and hundreds of thousands of Astartes. So similarly to Horus's failure to single-handedly crush the Interrex, the Iron Hands required additional support, and so the Emperor's Children Legion were called in as reinforcements. The combined Astartes force eventually made the discovery that the Diasporax used these hidden solar collectors to fuel their starships, and so the Space Marines assaulted these solar collectors, forcing the Diasporax into open battle to protect them, and sadly this was what then led to the defeat of the Diasporax, and so their culture was purged from the galaxy. But then we still have the truly saddening final words of the alien Psyker acting as the Diasporax command ship's captain, and these were telepathically broadcast to one of the senior Astartes. The message received was, "All we wished was to be left alone." Any surviving human Diasporax prisoners were handed over to the planetary governor of the closest compliant world to be used as slave labour, and any and all of the aliens were simply executed, any remnants of their fleet destroyed by the Imperials. All of this together makes you proud to be a member of the Imperium, doesn't it?
Yeah, always sort of funny to see this sort of thing where, again, the Emperor has his very strict rules about conduct and that sort of thing, and at least about Xenos, but it always boggles my mind when people have innovative technologies And the Emperor, who is a complete and devout atheist, right, who absolutely is on board with science and technology up to that one carve out for AI, and yet he just has this hate, this deep hatred of other technologies, right, other than Terra and Mars. And that always sort of puzzles me, that spread throughout the galaxy, he's doing his reconquest, and yet he leaves so many technological innovations or tactical innovations on the table. Surely these ships that were able to dip, duck, dodge, dive, and dodge around the Astartes fleets could have offered something of value to the Emperor.
Hail the glorious Emperor of Man. One of my favourite nightmares of the 40k verse comes from a relatively recent reference in Plague War, which describes the truly horrifying process whereby a human is sealed in a pocket bubble by the powers of chaos, Nurgle, and used as a means to bring a herald into reality, so that it might simply converse with Typhus. This is the mortal herald of Nurgle in the Imperium, originally was first Captain Typhon of the Death Guard. Now, it's not uncommon for ordinary...
I love how Typhus is also, like, a reference, I think, to typhoid, which is I think another name for scarlet fever.
Humans who are within a
something that we vaccinate against routinely now.
City or ship which becomes captured by the plague entities of Nurgle or that of the Death Guard to succumb to any number of bizarre diseases and body wastage, eyes for boiling out of your sockets, extreme muscle wastage, general deterioration and intense pain for those who suffer the blight of Nurgle. However, for those in the Death Guard, the Plague Marines, they have seen this many times over. So when Typhus sees in this instance just how terribly this single Imperial officer is being tormented, he has to literally stop what he's doing to stand in awe at the horror Nurgle is wreaking on this poor man, specifically because it's not merely one single life-to-death process. Nurgle ruins this guy over and over by sealing him in this kind of pocket localized time bubble, and this again bleeds into my ongoing note about time and the warp and their ability in the demons in the warp to do strange things with time beyond the confines of our ordinary four-dimensional verse. So this
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of radiation sickness. If you ever want to have a horrifying Wikipedia read, you can look up fatal radiation sickness. And it's horrible on so many levels, but mostly it initially involves like a very, if you're exposed to a lethal dose of radiation, you'll have the sensation of being like sunburned. You might experience some nausea. You'll experience some like a standard sort of poisoning combined with sunburn, very bad burns or sunburns. And then after a couple days, you'll start to feel better. And that's sort of a trick because your cell's DNA is fundamentally damaged, and slowly your body will lose the ability to replace old cells. And so every system in your body will start to collapse. Your skin and flesh will start to slough off. Your muscles will become unable to fire or fire uncontrollably. Your central nervous system will, again, either shut down or shoot off uncontrollable bursts of pain. It is maybe the most horrific death you can conceive of. And basically the only thing you can do in response to this horrific radiation poisoning is get pumped full of morphine and probably die of that in lieu of letting your body waste away the rest of the way.
This human is trapped by Nurgle, who then proceeds to rapidly...
I want to say there was a Russian dissident who was poisoned with a radioactive chemical, and that's what killed him, is actually the radiation exposure.
Decompose and recompose him, all while keeping him alive. It is truly an obscene horror, probably one of the most obscene horrors that I've seen in 40k. His body rotting, flesh swelling to the point that it tears, splits, bursts, choose your verb. It's so extreme that even when Typhus, who has seen his fair share of such ravages before, is overcome and stands in awe, observing with a grim fascination how the Lord of Decay is giving such attention to this suffering. As the Imperial is being twisted with pain, he questions what is Typhus doing to him, to To which Typhus replies, "Done? I have not done anything. This is not one of my ailments, but someone is doing something to you. I wonder who." So the man continues to suffer the torments of Nurgle, who makes him convulse so powerfully his bones actually begin to audibly crack and break into pieces, protruding out through the limbs and the body. It describes how Grandfather Nurgle is kind and so wishes all those who are afflicted by his gifts to fully enjoy the experience. And so the man's soul remains confined to his body. In a minute, the man looks to have been dead a week, in 2 minutes a month, and yet he still lives. His body all the while is being destroyed by swelling, bursting, rotting various organs.
This is just grisly, man.
Growing, shrinking, all manner of liquids pouring.
I love how he's spliced in like gross special effects scenes from movies.
Pouring out from
like I saw Indiana Jones there.
Various states of being. Typhus continues to be captivated by this, declaring that the man is truly blessed. And the mortal herald of Nurgle says, "Know this, little man. Few of your kind experience such exquisite extinctions, and few still are permitted to see the cornucopia of rebirth your mortal shells permit. You are favoured." Eventually, through this bizarre spectacle, a Nurgling then comes through using this man's as a means to enter real space, crawling out of the rotting mess, and then turns to eat what is left of the man, chewing through mounds of rotten flesh matter, fat and viscera, before it becomes the Herald of Nurgle, forming itself out of this disgusting mess. All of this was simply a means for Nurgle to converse with Typhus, which then they do have a conversation, all while simultaneously somehow the slurried remains of the Imperial officer are still alive. This is a bad day to be alive.
Jesus. All that for a phone call. Damn.
Now, there is a specific reason why Tyranids are among the most feared enemies of humanity, and part of it is of course their unrelenting, all-devouring nature. But the other part of it is a much more deeper, primordial fear that lurks within us. That fairly reasonable fear of being chomped on by something that is wanting to just eat you alive. There's a reason why humans have an immense fear of sharks, despite the number of shark deaths being insanely low comparative to other things we already think of as being rare occurrences. Certainly movies have a part to play. But my point though is that humans have various deep fears that, while not shared by all, are fairly common generally speaking. That is to say, if something is crawly, slithery or very big and teethy, or if it's likely to do something horrible to you with burns or egg laying or whatever, we tend to be like, nope, burn it all down. This is the Imperium's approach to the Tyranids as well, burn it with Promethium. And if that
Russian Badger had figured that out in one of his more popular videos.
doesn't work, burn the planet down. So spare a thought for the guardsmen facing down these small and large Tyranid forms, for they are all equally as unpleasant. You're either going to be chomped to pieces by rippers, which are just a large kind of crustacean with many razor-sharp jaws, worse still
Oh, that sounds stolen from the Alien franchise. GW stealing IP? No way.
rippers tend to appear in swarms, a writhing sea of horror driven purely by appetite. Like all the Tyranid forms, they are terrifyingly persistent and quite capable of pulling down creatures many times their size. Once a ripper's jaws tighten around its prey, they stay clamped shut until a mouthful of flesh is torn away or the ripper is slain. For any unfortunate humans too slow or too injured to run or put up a fight, rippers will likely chomp their way through, or worse, inside of you, and just continue until they have had their fill. Whilst all Tyranid forms are horrifying, it's really their use of acids that are most traumatic. Guardsmen being hit by these vast acid sprays, and the term spray may make it sound like they were just hit with a bit of a splash that could be either sheltered from, avoided, quickly take off your gear. Tyranid weapons are not like a little spritz. It's a dumping wave of acid fired from horrifying creatures like the Tyrannofex. These things can take out entire infantry formations, and the humans who get hit by this will be left as semi-living pools of flesh liquid. The process of death is not going to be fast or pain-free.
Yeah, there's actually a pretty extensive list and details in the Treaty Against Chemical Weapons, Treaty Against Biological Weapons, and the Geneva Convention generally, that sort of puts the stop or puts limits on biological weapons. Now, a lot of countries, right, abide by their treaty obligations and don't develop these. The Soviet Union and the United States developed a lot of very powerful biological weapons during the Cold War, again, sort of in the fear that the other one was going to do it, and that they had to have these other biological weapons as a check. VX gas is probably the most well known, and it's sort of funny because a lot of the NBC protective gear, i.e. the gas mask that I always wear and stuff, that actually may or may not be effective against certain types. For example, it wouldn't do much, I think, against chlorine gas, but it would stop an organic compound like VX. That said, nowadays we have a pretty strong prohibition against these sort of things, though at least on paper. As happened famously, I think 10 years ago maybe, Assad in Syria had developed chemical munitions, was using them against his own people and rest of towns and attacking civilians, and the international community was sort of in a bind because this was something that they had sworn they would never allow to occur, but no one really had the political will to actually send troops into Syria to settle this conflict and to discipline Assad for his use of chemical munitions on civilians. And so ultimately, basically the international community made Assad pinky promise that he would give up all his chemical weapons and that they would ship them to like Norway for disposal. And that's what happened. And there hasn't been any public reports of chemical munitions used in that conflict since that I am aware of. But the point, all this to say, is that humanity can develop some pretty horrific stuff, against itself.
They're going to be
no Tyranid needed.
Left in a deafening chorus of screaming, running, scratching at their bodies and faces, attempting to get this corrosive material that is literally dissolving their limbs as they try to free themselves from the nightmare. Some will likely become stuck together as the bodies are fusing, tearing. Before long it will simply be a pool of guardsmen. This, though, for me, is not even the worst of the Tyranid weapons. I reserve this for their horrifying use of bioweapons like the Death Spitter and Devourer. Both of these are highly unpleasant and involve small, aggressive maggot-like creatures burrowing through into your body and basically eating you alive from the inside out. Whenever these are fired at you, the maggots strike with highly acidic fluid splashing and dissolving through near anything enough that it comes into contact with. They use this acidic layer to burrow through inside of a victim, either eating their way through you or, dependent on the specific type of creature, they may begin to attack the neurological tissues of the still alive victim before moving on through your spinal column and the brain. Sheer unrelenting terror is almost instantly followed by madness as a result of the unbearable and unescapable agony caused by this process. Should an individual be able to maintain enough temporary coherency, suicide by their own weapons is often the option, but witnesses have noted that where this is not possible, only the mercy of their comrades can deliver them from the hell they're enduring, and they still have to worry about where those bizarre Xenos maggots are going afterwards.
So, what I do think is interesting is that most most modern chemical weapons and biological weapons developed in the 20th century actually rely on the human immune system to kill the target. And the good example is what are called blister agents. And blister agents basically hack the immune response, the blistering, the filling of a damaged area with pus, and they make it so that every single area that the weapon contacts is blistered. And you can imagine that across an entire biological system, that entire arm can really, really mess somebody up. But what's even more dangerous is if you inhale it, because you end up with blisters on your lungs, right? Your lungs become instantly converted into scar tissue, and you will die horrifically. Unless, and this is the weird thing, you immediately inject a chemical called atropine, and they actually issue it to soldiers, and it is in an auto-injector, and you're supposed to stab yourself with it as soon as you're exposed to VX, and it can basically stop the blistering effect in its tracks. Of course, you won't blister for a burn or anything, but the atropine will shut down this VX sort of process. But if you can't shut it down, right? This is also actually what kills in COVID. They call it the Cytokine Storm, when the immune system is so aggressive in fighting this invader that it begins to damage healthy tissues in the process. That's the exact same thing that makes blister agents so dangerous, is hijacking the immune system to start to destroy the body in a large enough scale. Again, a blister on my foot from a hike, not a big deal. A third of your skin blistered up is a tremendous problem for your body to sustain metabolically. That's to say nothing of, say, a blistering of the eyes, blistering of the nasal cavity, blistering of the lungs. The potential disaster is just tremendous.
In relation to these weapons,
that's the point, is that has been found to be the best way to biologically kill humans, is to actually not attack them directly with a virus, but have their own immune systems go haywire and then kill them with that virus.
Most interesting was how the Imperium first discovered the Tyranid held these bizarre bioweapons. Once again, it involves the expert on Tyranids, one Inquisitor Cryptman, who had come into possession of a strange new Xenos thing. He was unsure just what this thing was, but he'd requested a psyker to read this bizarre fleshy matter alien entity and discover just what it was. The psyker described it as like trying to read the mind of a spider, and Cryptman pushes him to delve deeper into it with his power. The psyker describes it as being alive, sentient, hating us. It was a fierce thing. It lives to bite and chew and spit. And he describes how within this thing, one bites, one guides, one dies. That one of the things inside this organism lives to be a projectile. It's a weapon, he would finally exclaim, and it's alive. Cryptman is taken aback by this. A living weapon? A living rifle? He could not believe this. Weapons were designed, they were not born. How could such a thing even evolve to exist? And here's when things get completely insane. The psyker now starts to behave really strangely. Cryptman notices the psyker is talking gibberish and behaving really weird. And soon he picks up the Xenos flesh weapon, speaking, "We hunted the meat things to lay the young eggs within their flesh. Again and again we send them forth." The psyker turns to shoot at Cryptman, and a vomiting shrill roar erupts as the acidic bile maggots fire at high velocity and impact a wall behind Cryptman as he leaps out of the way. He quickly turns to put a round into the psyker, exploding his chest, but still he continues to attempt speaking as he's lying on the floor, seemingly still connected by the mind control of this Xenos weapon. Cryptman realizes what has occurred on the ship where this weapon was originally found, where the remains of the crew who had seemingly been eaten from the inside out and partially dissolved were found. Only their astropath was discovered intact, still in the vacuum of space nearby, and Cryptman has realized that the weapon in fact is the culprit here. It had merged with the mind of their astropath, who had then turned the weapon on the crew, bizarrely then though placing the bioweapon in stasis before decompressing the ship. This was one of the very first accounts involving Cryptman, and one of the first encounters.
Okay, wait, I can't wrap my head around how that lore works with the Tyranids, who don't really have a warp presence. They cast the warp shadow, but they can corrupt an astropath just through a weapon, or the weapon itself did the corrupting. Like, the weapon also has tremendous psychic energy. And how can something with such a small brain, with such a tiny amount of intelligence, if you can even call it that, corrupt an astropath?
For the Imperium with Tyranid things. I should note though, this is a very early edition reference, and this kind of behaviour with Tyranid weapons is not specifically commonly noted any longer. However, I mention it both for interest, and you guys know that I often consider older stuff still relevant, and I think in this specific instance it still seems at least plausible.
I mean, yeah, here's the thing that I think is interesting with the Tyranids. As we've established, Tyranids are always evolving, and they're always looking to find better and better ways to do things. So, wouldn't shock me at all if say their first encounter was with, I don't know, the Eldar, right? Or another psychically attuned race. Then the ability to corrupt strongly psychically attuned beings would be something you would logically imbue in all weapons as a way of protecting them, right? You'd want them to have this tremendous psychic power so that they could never be, let's say the reverse happened, right? Somehow a Carnifex was taken over psychically by this other species. that could be a disaster. So maybe they would just evolve everything with strong psychic defenses. Once that species is wiped out and they're fighting humans, then they realize, hey, there's not actually much return to having this, investing in this psychic corruption. It's harder to psychically corrupt humans. They don't necessarily operate the same way. Let's just cycle this feature off of our weaponry.
And only further reinforces the terrifying horror of the Great Devourer and the truly appalling alien nature of themselves and their bizarre symbiotic synapse psychic identity.
Becoming a part of the Screaming Gallery.
And
We're
then
all the
lastly
peanut
for
gallery
today,
here.
I choose the Screaming Gallery, but I could equally have titled this something something Night Lords. Heads up, don't get captured by the Night Lords. Because getting captured really by any Chaos Space Marine is always going to be pretty awful. Nurgle isn't going to end well, nor would the Iron Warriors, where your fate could range from being twisted into some nightmare form, passed over to the Dark Mechanicum for some kind of unthinkable surgery, or made into a paste to be used as literal mortar. The Night Lords, though, do seem to take a specific angle to the torments of ordinary mortals, best described by themselves: "We are the 8th Legion. We wound flesh, steel and souls alike. We scar memories. We scar minds. Our actions must mean something, or we deserve to be forgotten, left to rot amongst ancient mythology." It's important to remember that for Chaos Space Marines, the traitors who have turned to the forces of Chaos, and more specifically it's usually those who worship what is known as Chaos Undivided, legions like the Iron Warriors, Black Legion, Wordbearers. Debatably, worshippers of Chaos Undivided worship in its most pure form, although some would say they simply lack the will and conviction to commit to a specific god of chaos. And the key thing to understand always when it comes to chaos is to remember that the gods of chaos spend the vast majority of their attention on what's happening within the warp. It's easy for mortals who are so obsessed with their own importance to forget that the chaos gods really don't pay huge attention to what's happening in real space, the Imperium. They expend a very small amount of attention here, but their minions are the ones who actively focus on material space, not the chaos gods themselves. Worshippers of chaos gods, or just Chaos Undivided, seek to empower themselves and chaos through sacrifice or actions.
Okay, I appreciate that this all sort of lines up with our friend Mimaroth from Space Marine, the game.
That best serve their chosen deity, in order to gain even the most mild attention of a chaos power, and this means creating a powerful psychic or soul disturbance, and usually that is achieved by inflicting terrible suffering. Fairly easy to really work out the parameters. It should be noted also, this does not always mean having though to inflict physical suffering, although very often it is. One of the most offensive things about the period known as the Heresy was very simply Astartes fighting Astartes, as was noted especially early on in, for example, the betrayal at Calth. This act in and of itself was so disgusting to the Loyalist Marines, their sheer outrage and horrific betrayals that would occur served Chaos very well. The murders of brothers carried more weight in terms of emotional and soul trauma, so very often Chaos Marines seek to inflict nightmarish actions of creativity and torment, not entirely unlike, as I noted earlier, the Drakari, and the Screaming Gallery of the Night Lords was merely one such thing. Other creative actions similar have taken place, like the astropathic Mortis Cry, used to create a psychic resonance feedback loop, but that is another thing entirely.
Yeah, wow, this sounds like a tremendous waste of energy and creativity from the Chaos Space Marines. Not sure how this serves any purpose. Truly, the only way to understand, I think, the Chaos Space Marines or the Chaos mentality is just to be like, this is pure corruption, and you just have this like deep lens of seeing the universe through your chaos god, and like they must experience themselves just so differently than the Imperium experiences them. That's the only explanation I can come up with.
The Screaming Gallery was the design of the Night Lord's Primarch Conrad Kurz, and essentially it was an entire corridor and chamber made up of the broken, fused bodies of still living, permanently trapped, liquid-fed humans. It ranks up there as one of the most nightmarish things in 40k. One of the most nightmarish things. It actually comes into two stages as well, one dead and the other living, because the halls which lead to the Screaming Gallery of the Night Lord's Primarch are decorated with these tortured, twisted forms of human figures. In fact, actually, these are common across all Night Lord's bastions and fortresses. However, they're not carvings. They are in fact humans who have been entombed. Men, women, children alike. Their miserable sufferings are on display, their final forms existing as permanent, timeless reminders of their agony. The Night Lords often focus on this distillation of suffering to bring a sense of the most powerful emotional resonance. It's like when you look at a photograph which has some emotional attachment. If you saw it in a...
I mean, also, if you had to walk through those halls to get hooked up to whatever nonsense was awaiting you, your level of terror would be increased greatly by walking by these suffering, still living, or almost dead figures.
Film or a movie or just video, it's gone in a second. But when something is enshrined in a permanent state, it somehow amplifies the power of that image over and over and over, and the more you look at it, the more you feel from it. That is the concept here. These figures that adorn the fortresses of the 8th Legion were once living humans, but who have now been dosed in their final moments with powerful paralytic drugs rendering them essentially statue-like. They will then have been coated with a slurry of rockcrete to permanently entomb their final emotional state. But this though pales in comparison to the actual Screaming Gallery of the Primarch, because had devised a far more horrifying decor for what would become his war chamber during the heresy. This place was lined across the walls, even the floor, with the broken, fused, living remains of mortal humans, and it was known as the Screaming Gallery, for it was filled permanently with the screams and tormented cries and wailing of those embedded within its walls. It would be impossible for any entering this place to avoid laying sight upon a walkway lined with the faces, humans, eyes, noses, mouths, all somehow blended and fused into a singular surface. Sometimes dull moans, more often piercing, tormented, shrieking. This is
uncomfortable, actually. Yeah, I've seen enough grisly stuff, for one lifetime, so I'm just looking to get past this part.
With the main chamber of the large hall used by the Primarch, amplified and created this cacophony of horror and an unending chorus of screaming. As told by a member of the Night Lords, the Primarch wanted to reshape the external world to match the sin within his mind. The dark, macabre work of art was kept in a state of living, perpetual suffering by a team of servitors and techs who would continually feed the mortals via liquid tubes behind the facades, intravenously feeding them a continual concoction of nutrients and drugs to prevent them succumbing to their mind-bendingly traumatic state of living death. Additional blood filters and organ simulators were situated beneath the floor. Robed servitors would quietly sweep the chamber, misting the faces of the condemned with water vapour to keep them moist. The gallery was an ocean of suffering and truly offensive to humanity in the most egregious terms imaginable. It was such a trauma, even some of the Astartes struggled to contend with it at first, but the most disturbing descriptions come from those later who described how they eventually became desensitized to the horror of the Screaming Gallery.
Acculturated.
That despite the inescapable screaming, wailing, crying and pitiful moaning, they became immune to the misery, and that in time it even became enjoyable. That it enabled those members of the 8th Legion who attended their Primarch to be able to think with clarity and focus.
I think it's interesting. I imagine that if your goal was to get people to find that as pleasurable, you would have to just condition them to do it. You would have to have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of positive experiences in that room, and you could eventually reprogram people to associate the sounds and sights of something like that as being positive. But you would just have to reward your Astartes in that room, praise them after a battle in that room, give them prestigious awards and new positions in that room, really strongly associate that noise and that environment with positive occurrences.
One Astartes described how at first it was meaningless, but afterwards it became music. I decided to keep this list on the shorter side today so I can give you guys more regular content alongside long form stuff where we dive a bit deeper. As always, thank you for joining me here on the channel. If you enjoyed, please remember to hit the like, it genuinely helps me out. Remember to tell me your own worst things to be alive in 40k for below. It could be maybe a specific goal.
Alright guys, we are going to stop it right there. Thanks again to Luetin. Always has awesome lore videos, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Be sure, of course, to check out the merch store. lots of new stuff, updated the links, should be good to go. And until next time, I will see you guys later.